You've seen the iconic image 1,000 times. Marilyn Monroe standing over a subway grate, her white dress billowing around her. But did you know the famous scene destroyed her marriage, that the designer dismissed his most famous creation as that silly little dress? Or that 4 different versions of the costume were made for filming? From a sketch that sold for $50,000 to claims the dress wasn't even designed but bought off the rack, this Hollywood icon hides shocking secrets beneath its pleated skirt. Here are 15 weird facts you didn't know about the 7-year itch's white dress. Fact 1. The designer called it that silly little dress. William Travilla was one of Hollywood's most respected costume designers, having won an Academy Award for his work on The Adventures of Don Juan in 1948. But he had a surprisingly dismissive attitude toward what would become his most famous creation. Despite designing costumes for 8 of Marilyn Monroe's films and creating some of cinema's most memorable looks, Travilla referred to the white halter dress from the 7-year itch as that silly little dress, a phrase that revealed just how little he thought of the garment that would define his entire career. At the time, he designed it in 1954 while his wife Donna Drake was away on vacation. Travilla had no idea this simple cocktail dress would overshadow everything else he ever created, including the iconic pink gown Monroe wore in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and costumes for over 270 other celebrities throughout his decades-long career. Travilla's relationship with Monroe was both professional and personal, as he admitted they had a brief affair. And the actress adored his figure-hugging design so much that she once wrote to him saying, "Billy dear, please dress me forever. I love you." Yet even with this close connection and his obvious talent for understanding what worked on Monroe's famous figure, Travilla simply didn't recognize the cultural impact this particular dress would have. His casual dismissal of the costume speaks to how unpredictable fame can be in Hollywood, where a designer's silly little afterthought becomes more famous than award-winning work he labored over. The dress that Travilla thought so little of would eventually sell for $4.6 million at auction in 2011, and the original sketch he drew of it fetched $50,000 after his death in 1990. Even decades after both Travilla and Monroe passed away, that silly little dress remains one of the most instantly recognizable costumes in film history, proving that sometimes artists are the worst judges of their own iconic work. Fact 2. 4 identical dresses were made for filming. Most people assume there was only one white dress used in the famous subway scene from the 7-year itch. But according to Andrew Hansford, the curator of the Travilla estate in England, William Travilla actually delivered 4 separate subway scene dresses to 20th Century Fox for the production. This revelation came from Travilla's own detailed notes and records, which Hansford discovered while cataloging the designer's patterns, sketches, and accounts of how his costumes were made. The existence of multiple dresses makes sense when you consider the practical demands of filming, since costumes often get damaged, stained, or need backups during production. But it also raises fascinating questions about which dress became the famous one that eventually sold for millions of dollars. The fact that 4 dresses were made became particularly important years later when questions arose about the authenticity of the dress sold at auction by Debbie Reynolds in 2011. Costume experts and Monroe collectors noticed differences in the pleating, hem length, and overall appearance between the Reynolds dress and the one seen in photographs of Monroe wearing it during filming. Some researchers discovered that one of the original Travilla subway dresses was later worn by actress Roxanne Arlen in the 1962 film Bachelor Flat, which showed clear evidence that at least one of the 4 dresses had been altered and recycled by the studio. Travilla himself confirmed in taped interviews that Debbie Reynolds owned an original subway scene dress, and he even borrowed it from her at one point to recreate his patterns after his originals were lost in a house fire. The existence of 4 dresses means that the history of this iconic costume is more complicated than anyone realized, with multiple versions floating around over the decades, some possibly altered for other productions, and others potentially still undiscovered in private collections or forgotten studio warehouses. Fact 3. The dress may have been bought off the rack. One of the most controversial claims about the famous white dress is that William Travilla might not have actually designed it at all, but instead simply bought it ready-made from a clothing store. This accusation appeared in the book Hollywood Costume: Glamour, Glitter, Romance by Dale McConaughey and Diana Vreeland, which suggested that rather than creating the dress from scratch, as he always maintained, Travilla purchased it off the rack and passed it off as his own design. The claim struck at the heart of Travilla's professional reputation, and he vehemently denied it for the rest of his life, insisting that he had sketched the design while on vacation with his wife Donna Drake and then personally crafted it upon returning to the studio. The controversy highlights an interesting aspect of Hollywood costume design during that era, when the line between custom-made and store-bought costumes wasn't always clear, and designers sometimes modified existing garments rather than creating everything from nothing. Travilla maintained that he specifically chose rayon acetate crepe fabric because natural materials wouldn't hold the pleats properly, and that he carefully engineered the bias cut construction with a halter top and sunburst pleats to create the exact effect he wanted for the subway scene. He had original sketches and patterns to support his claim, though some of these were unfortunately lost in a house fire at his home, which made it harder to definitively prove his version of events. Despite the accusations in the book, most costume historians and experts believe Travilla did design the dress based on the detailed construction methods he described and the existence of his preparatory sketches that were sold at auction. The fact that he created 4 identical versions for the production also suggests a level of custom work that wouldn't make sense if he had simply purchased a ready-made dress, though the controversy has never been completely resolved and continues to be debated among Monroe collectors and film costume enthusiasts. Fact 4. Marilyn wore 2 pairs of underwear. During the filming of the subway scene, Marilyn Monroe discovered an unexpected problem with the powerful set lights that director Billy Wilder was using to illuminate the shot. When she looked at herself in the mirror or saw early test footage, Monroe realized that the bright lights were shining through her white dress and making her white underwear essentially see-through, which would have been completely unacceptable for a film being made under the strict censorship rules of 1954. Concerned about maintaining some level of modesty in what was already going to be a revealing scene, Monroe asked the wardrobe department if she could wear a second pair of white panties over the first pair, hoping that the double layer would provide enough coverage to prevent anything inappropriate from showing on camera. The wardrobe team agreed to her request, and Monroe put on 2 pairs of underwear before filming the scene, and when she tested this solution in her dressing room, the extra layer seemed to work well enough to give her confidence. However, once she was actually standing over the subway grate with the powerful wind machines blowing her skirt up and the intense lighting rigs pointed directly at her, the double layer of underwear still didn't completely solve the transparency problem. Photographs from the shoot show that even with 2 pairs of panties, her undergarments were still visible through the thin fabric of the dress when it billowed up around her, though the images were deemed acceptable enough for the film to proceed. This detail reveals how carefully Monroe tried to navigate the balance between creating a sexy, playful scene that would captivate audiences while still protecting her dignity and staying within the boundaries of what was considered appropriate for Hollywood at the time. The fact that even her practical solution didn't entirely work shows just how challenging it was to film such a physically revealing scene under the technology and moral standards of the 1950s. Fact 5. The scene ended. Marilyn's marriage to Joe DiMaggio. The famous subway scene didn't just make film history, it also destroyed Marilyn Monroe's marriage to baseball legend Joe DiMaggio, who was on set in New York City to watch his wife film what would become the most iconic moment of her career. DiMaggio hadn't originally planned to be there, but his friend, gossip columnist Walter Winchell, had gotten wind of the scandalous scene being filmed and summoned DiMaggio to come see what his wife was doing in front of thousands of spectators and photographers on Lexington Avenue in the early morning hours of September 15, 1954. When DiMaggio arrived and saw Monroe standing over the subway grate with her dress blowing up repeatedly while the crowd of mostly men whistled and cheered, witnesses reported seeing what director Billy Wilder later described as a look of death on the baseball star's face before he stormed off the set in absolute fury. DiMaggio was a deeply conservative man who held traditional views about marriage and gender roles, and watching his wife perform what he considered an exhibitionist display in front of thousands of people was more than he could tolerate. After leaving the filming location, DiMaggio went to the St. Regis Hotel to wait for Monroe, and when she returned to their hotel suite later that night, the couple had a ferocious argument that several biographers have documented as one of the breaking points in their turbulent relationship. Some sources reported that the fight may have turned physical, though this has never been definitively confirmed. But what is certain is that DiMaggio returned home the very next day. Just a few weeks after returning to Los Angeles, once production wrapped in New York, Monroe filed for divorce from DiMaggio on grounds of mental cruelty, and newspapers ran headlines like "Marilyn splits with Joe over sexy pictures" to explain the breakup, making it clear to everyone that the subway scene had played a major role in ending the marriage. Fact 6. None of the New York footage was used. The elaborate on-location shoot in New York City turned out to be a complete waste of time and film stock because despite shooting the subway scene 14 times on the corner of Lexington Avenue and 52nd Street, with approximately 5,000 spectators watching, not a single frame of that footage made it into the final movie. Director Billy Wilder had deliberately turned the shoot into a media circus, even having bleachers set up for photographers and members of the press, and he invited fans to come watch the filming that was scheduled to begin at 1 o'clock in the morning on September 15, 1954. The strategy worked brilliantly for generating publicity, as dozens of photographers captured the moment, and newspapers around the world ran photos of Monroe with her dress blowing up. But it backfired completely when it came to actually filming a usable scene. The massive crowd that Wilder had deliberately attracted created so much noise that the audio recordings were completely unusable, with people whistling, cheering, shouting, and yelling higher every single time the wind machine beneath the subway grate blew Monroe's skirt up around her legs. Monroe herself kept missing her lines during take after take, possibly because she was distracted by the chaos of the enormous crowd and the presence of her furious husband, Joe DiMaggio, watching from the sidelines. But even when she got the dialogue right, the background noise made it impossible to hear anything she was saying. After 14 attempts that stretched through the early morning hours, Wilder finally gave up on the location shoot. When production moved back to Los Angeles, the entire subway scene had to be completely reshot on a carefully controlled soundstage at the 20th Century Fox studio lot, where Wilder recreated Lexington Avenue and filmed the sequence over again with proper sound equipment and no screaming fans. The only useful thing that came from the New York shoot was the still photographs that became iconic images, while all the actual movie footage ended up on the cutting room floor. Fact 7. The photographer invented the flying skirt concept. The iconic image of a woman's skirt blowing up in the wind wasn't actually invented for the 7-year itch, but was the brainchild of photographer Sam Shaw, who had experimented with the same concept more than a decade earlier in the 1940s. Shaw had orchestrated a photo shoot for Friday magazine that featured a sailor and a young girl playing in a wind tunnel at Coney Island. And when he captured a playful photograph of the girl's skirt moving from the wind, the magazine put it on the cover, and the issue sold out immediately, proving that audiences were captivated by this kind of image. Years later, when Shaw was hired as the special still photographer for the 7-year itch and read through the script, he immediately recognized an opportunity to revisit his successful skirt-blowing concept and turn it into something even more memorable. Shaw was not just the photographer on set, but also a close personal friend of Marilyn Monroe. And it was actually his idea to use a picture from the subway grate scene as the main promotional image for the film, making him responsible for one of the smartest marketing decisions in Hollywood history. Monroe had given Shaw the nickname Sam Spade, after Humphrey Bogart's character in The Maltese Falcon, and during the chaotic New York filming with thousands of spectators crowding around. Monroe turned to look directly at her friend in the front row and called out, "Hi, Sam Spade," before he clicked the camera and captured what he always referred to as her composition. Shaw's granddaughter, Melissa Stevens, later shared stories about how her grandfather had maintained a close friendship with Monroe throughout her career, and felt a special pride in having created the visual concept that would become synonymous with her image. The fact that one of cinema's most famous moments originated from a magazine photo shoot about a girl at a Coney Island amusement park shows how creative ideas can evolve and resurface in unexpected ways. Fact 8. Debbie Reynolds bought it for just $200. In 1971, actress Debbie Reynolds purchased what would become one of the most valuable pieces of movie memorabilia in history for the shockingly low price of just $200 directly from 20th Century Fox Studios. Reynolds had started her collection when MGM Studios auctioned off a vast amount of their costumes and props in the 1970s, which opened up a new market for film enthusiasts and scholars to get their hands on items they had only seen on screen. But Reynolds had a bigger vision in mind than simply collecting interesting pieces. Her dream was to create a museum dedicated to preserving iconic Hollywood memorabilia and capturing the essence of how cinema had transformed over time. And over the course of 4 decades, she managed to collect approximately 3,500 items, including costumes, props, film posters, and furniture from some of the most beloved movies ever made. The white dress had remained with the studio for several years after Monroe's death in 1962, and when Reynolds had the opportunity to buy it during what was called a pre-sale, where she purchased all of the Marilyn Monroe wardrobe pieces before they went to public auction, she jumped at the chance for what seemed like a bargain price at the time. Reynolds became passionate about preserving these pieces of film history and spoke publicly about her hopes to open a museum, telling Oprah Winfrey during an interview that the dress had become écru because, as you know, it is very, very old now, showing how the originally white fabric had yellowed with age. Unfortunately, Reynolds' dream of opening a museum never came to fruition, and the financial burden of maintaining such a massive collection eventually became too much for her to handle. The $200 investment she made in 1971 would eventually turn into millions when she was forced to auction off her collection in 2011. Fact 9. It sold for $4.6 million at auction. When Debbie Reynolds was forced to auction off pieces from her massive Hollywood memorabilia collection in June of 2011 due to financial difficulties, the white subway dress became the star attraction and shattered every existing record for movie costume sales. Profiles in History, the auction house handling the sale at the Paley Center for Media in downtown Beverly Hills, had estimated the dress would sell for somewhere between $1 million and $2 million, which would have already made it one of the most expensive costumes ever sold. But nobody anticipated just how far collectors and investors were willing to go to own this iconic piece of American pop culture history. When the bidding started, the price quickly soared past the estimated range, and by the time the hammer came down, the winning bid was $4.6 million, completely obliterating the previous record of $923,000 that had been paid for Audrey Hepburn's little black dress from Breakfast at Tiffany's. The final price didn't stop at $4.6 million, because once the buyer's premium and various fees were added to the total, the actual amount paid rose to approximately $5.6 million, depending on the bidding method and payment structure used by the winner. The identity of the buyer was not revealed publicly, and the dress went into a private collection where it remained hidden from public view for over a year before mysteriously appearing at an exhibition in London. The auction was attended by collectors, investors, and Monroe enthusiasts from around the world, and the entire event generated massive media coverage as people watched history being made in real time. The record-breaking sale proved that Marilyn Monroe's cultural significance had only grown stronger in the decade since her death in 1962, and it established the subway dress as not just a piece of costume history, but as a genuine artifact of 20th century American culture worth more than many priceless works of art. Fact 10. The original costume sketch sold for $50,000. Even William Trevilla's original design sketch for the white dress proved to be incredibly valuable on its own, selling for $50,000 at auction after the designer's death in 1990, which showed that collectors were willing to pay enormous sums not just for the actual costume, but for any artifact connected to its creation. The sketch was accomplished in gouache, which is a type of thick watercolor paint on a 15-inch by 20-inch sheet of artist's illustration board, and it represented Trevilla's original concept drawing showing how he envisioned the dress would look on Marilyn Monroe before he ever cut a single piece of fabric. This preparatory artwork was ranked by some costume historians as one of the most important costume designs ever created for film, and its estimated auction value of $80,000 to $100,000 reflected just how significant people considered it to be as a piece of Hollywood history. The sketch had a dramatic backstory of its own, having been rescued from an all-consuming fire at the Trevilla offices in Los Angeles in 1991 by the designer's longtime business partner, Bill Saris, who managed to save it along with some other important pieces from Trevilla's collection before the flames destroyed everything. Saris became the owner of the sketch and eventually decided to sell it at a Profiles in History auction in December of 2004, where it was offered alongside an exact copy of the dress itself that Trevilla had created for touring and exhibition purposes. The fact that just the drawing could command such a high price demonstrates how thoroughly the subway scene and its costume had embedded themselves into American popular culture. Trevilla had left very detailed notes about how the dress was made, the specific fabric he used, and his inspiration for the costume design, and these documents, along with the sketch, helped preserve the technical and artistic process behind one of cinema's most recognizable garments for future generations of costume designers and film historians to study. Fact 11. The dress changed color over time. The iconic white dress that millions of people have seen in photographs and film clips wasn't actually white anymore by the time Debbie Reynolds owned it, having transformed into a yellowish cream color that fabric experts call ecru due to the natural aging process of the delicate material over several decades. During an interview with Oprah Winfrey, Reynolds explained the color change by saying, "It has become ecru because, as you know, it is very, very old now," acknowledging that the passage of time had taken a visible toll on the garment that was originally a bright ivory white when Trevilla created it in 1954. The dress was made from rayon acetate crepe, which is a type of fabric that combines natural cellulose fibers with synthetic materials, and this particular blend was known to be susceptible to yellowing and discoloration as it aged, especially when exposed to light, air, and changes in temperature over the years. Beyond just the color change, Trevilla himself had noted in taped interviews that the physical condition of the dress had deteriorated significantly, saying that after all these years it has changed color slightly and some of the threads have all but gone, which suggested that the fabric was literally falling apart in some areas. The delicate pleating that made the dress so visually striking on film required a specific type of fabric that would hold its shape, but that same material wasn't particularly durable when it came to long-term preservation. Costume conservation experts who examined the dress noted that some of the seams had pulled and worn, which wasn't surprising given how delicate the material was and how much stress it had endured during the original filming when it was blown up repeatedly by wind machines. The transformation from white to ecru actually added to the dress's authenticity as a genuine historical artifact rather than diminishing its value, because the visible aging proved that this was the real costume that had been worn over half a century earlier and not some modern reproduction. Fact 12. A similar dress was recycled for another film. One of the original Travilla dresses from the 7-Year Itch production didn't stay locked away in a vault, but was actually pulled out of the studio closets and reused 7 years later, when actress Roxanne Arlen wore it in the 1962 film Bachelor Flat, though it had been altered in several noticeable ways before appearing on screen again. This discovery became important evidence for costume historians trying to trace what happened to the multiple dresses that Travilla created for the subway scene, because it proved that at least one of them had been modified and recycled rather than being preserved in its original condition. The dress worn by Arlen in Bachelor Flat was clearly a Travilla design from the 7-Year Itch, based on its distinctive construction and style. But it featured several differences from the version Monroe wore, most notably a decorative bow attached to the lower back area that wasn't present on Monroe's costume. Since Bachelor Flat was considered a lower-budget production and Arlen was playing a secondary character rather than a leading role, it made perfect sense that the costume department would pull an existing dress from the studio storage and alter it rather than creating an exact replica or designing something completely new for her to wear. Researchers who examined photographs of the dress sold by Debbie Reynolds discovered evidence of stitching on the rear of that costume in exactly the same location where the bow appeared on Arlen's dress, which suggested that the Reynolds dress might actually be the one that was worn in Bachelor Flat after being modified. Additionally, there was a small hole in the Reynolds dress that matched the placement of a brooch that Arlen wore on the left side of the costume in the film, and detailed analysis revealed that the skirt appeared to have been shortened from the top, which would explain why the pleating looked different compared to photographs of Monroe wearing the original dress during filming of the 7-Year Itch. This revelation complicated the history of the famous costume and raised questions about whether the dress sold for millions was actually the one Monroe wore, or a modified version used in a later production. Fact 13. Meryl Streep helped find the dress's owner. After the dress sold for millions of dollars at auction in 2011, it disappeared into a private collection and nobody knew who had purchased it or where it was being kept, which created a major problem for costume designer and UCLA professor Deborah Nadoolman Landis when she was trying to assemble the Hollywood costume exhibition at London's Victoria and Albert Museum in 2012. Landis had spent years planning this massive exhibition and had originally hoped to use Debbie Reynolds' vast personal costume collection as the core of the show, but she was devastated to learn about the court-mandated auction that scattered Reynolds' treasures around the world. The subway dress was supposed to be one of the centerpiece items in the exhibition, but with the mysterious buyer refusing to come forward publicly, Landis had no way to track down the costume and no hope of borrowing it for the show. The breakthrough came during an interview that Landis conducted with Meryl Streep for the exhibition, when the curator happened to mention that she was desperately trying to locate a different costume, the white lace ascot dress that Audrey Hepburn wore as Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. Streep exclaimed that she knew the presumed owner of that dress and offered to help track her down through her Hollywood connections. When Streep finally got in touch with the collector, she discovered that the woman didn't actually own the ascot dress at all, but then the collector said something that stunned everyone involved, casually mentioning, "But I have Marilyn Monroe's 7-Year Itch dress. Any interest?" according to Landis's account of the conversation. This chance revelation solved the mystery of where the subway dress had gone after the auction, and the anonymous owner agreed to loan the gown to the exhibition, which allowed it to make its way to London and be displayed publicly for the first time since the sale. The last-minute addition made possible by Streep's networking became one of the highlights of the entire show. Fact 14. The fabric was scientifically engineered for wind. William Travilla didn't just randomly pick any white fabric for the subway dress, but instead carefully selected rayon acetate crepe after considering the specific technical requirements needed to make the scene work visually, because he needed a material that could solve several challenging problems at the same time. The biggest issue was that natural fabrics like cotton, silk, or linen wouldn't hold the stiff accordion pleats that were essential to the dress's design, since those materials would simply fall flat and lose their shape after being worn for even a short time. Travilla normally preferred working with 100% natural fabrics in his costume designs, but the pleating challenge forced him to use a special fabric that combined natural cellulose fibers with a percentage of man-made synthetic materials, creating a hybrid textile that could maintain its structured pleats throughout the demanding filming process. Beyond just holding pleats, the fabric also needed to have precisely the right weight and drape characteristics to create the dramatic billowing effect that the subway scene required, which meant it had to be heavy enough to swing and flow beautifully as Monroe walked, but simultaneously light enough to catch the breeze from the wind machines and blow up in an interesting and photogenic way. This delicate balance was incredibly difficult to achieve, and rayon acetate crepe turned out to be the perfect solution because it had exactly the properties Travilla was looking for. The fabric was also chosen for its ivory color and slightly glossy finish that would photograph well under the bright studio lights and create the clean, fresh, almost angelic appearance that Travilla wanted Monroe to project in the scene. Travilla described his vision for the costume as making Monroe look cool and clean in a dirty, dirty city, and wanting her to appear fresh and clean, talcum powdered, and adorable, which required not just the right design, but also the scientifically correct fabric choice. The fact that this particular type of rayon acetate crepe is now very hard, if not impossible, to find, with georgette being the closest modern equivalent, shows how specialized the material selection was for this iconic costume. Fact 15. Travilla kept it locked away. After Monroe's death. When Marilyn Monroe died tragically in 1962 at just 36 years old, William Travilla was so deeply affected by the loss of his friend and collaborator that he made the decision to lock away the white subway dress along with many of the other costumes he had created for her over the years, keeping them hidden from public view in a private collection that he refused to discuss or display. Travilla had designed Monroe's clothes for 8 of her films and had maintained both a professional relationship and a brief personal affair with the actress, so her death hit him particularly hard on an emotional level. For nearly 3 decades, he kept these precious garments locked away somewhere secure, and he was so secretive about their location and condition that rumors began circulating in Hollywood that the entire collection had been lost or destroyed, with some people speculating that the costumes no longer existed at all. The mystery surrounding the whereabouts of Monroe's most famous costumes persisted throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and collectors, historians, and Monroe fans had no idea whether these iconic pieces of film history would ever be seen again, or if they had simply vanished forever. It wasn't until Travilla died of lung cancer on November 2, 1990 at Good Samaritan Medical Center in Los Angeles that the truth finally came out about what had happened to the collection. After his death, the costumes were displayed by his longtime colleague and business partner, Bill Saris, who had worked closely with Travilla for many years and had been entrusted with preserving his legacy. The revelation that these costumes had survived and been carefully preserved all those years was a relief to the film preservation community, though some of the items had suffered damage over time simply from aging and storage conditions. The subway dress and other Monroe costumes eventually made their way into various collections, with some pieces going to Debbie Reynolds and others being sold at auction, finally allowing the public to see the garments that Travilla had kept hidden away as a private memorial to his most famous muse. Most famous muse. Most famous muse. Most famous muse.